Picture this. It's mid-afternoon, somewhere in ancient northern Africa, around 150,000 years ago, and two very different kinds of minds are experiencing the exact same moment in completely different ways. A woman is sitting near the remains of a morning fire, doing something genuinely unusual for the middle of the day. Waiting. Not waiting for food, not waiting for an immediate threat to resolve itself. Waiting because something is supposed to happen later, something she's been thinking about since this morning. Something that exists right now only in her mind as a future event that hasn't occurred yet but will, and she's organizing her entire current behavior around that anticipated future moment. Meanwhile, 20 feet away, a large monitor lizard is doing what monitor lizards do, sitting in the sun, processing the immediate sensory reality of right now with what appears to be zero concern for anything that isn't directly happening to it in this exact moment. Both of these creatures have brains. Both of them are, in a very basic biological sense, experiencing time passing. But something about the quality of that experience, the texture of it, what it actually means for their behavior and their inner life, is almost certainly profoundly different. And the question of exactly how different and exactly what that difference consists of turns out to be one of the most genuinely fascinating, most philosophically rich, and most practically important questions in all of cognitive science, with direct implications for how we understand ancient human minds, animal cognition, and what's actually special about human consciousness specifically. So here's what this video exists to dig into properly. Do animals feel time the same way we do? Not just track it, not just respond to its rhythms, but actually experience it as something with texture, duration, and emotional weight, the way ancient humans sitting by their evening fires almost certainly did? Stick around because the honest answer is considerably more nuanced, more surprising, and more genuinely illuminating about what makes human minds distinctive than a simple yes or no could ever capture. And by the end of this, you might think about your own experience of time in a way that's never quite occurred to you before. Let's start by unpacking what we actually mean when we ask whether animals feel time, because this question is doing several different things simultaneously, and pulling them apart makes the whole conversation dramatically clearer. There's biological time, the internal rhythms governing sleep cycles, hunger cycles, seasonal behavior, and various other physiological processes that clearly operate across essentially all living things, from the most cognitively simple to the most complex. There's behavioral time, the ability to time actions appropriately, learn that certain things follow other things, and adjust behavior based on experienced temporal patterns. And then there's something considerably more interesting and considerably more debated, what researchers studying animal cognition sometimes call mental time travel. The capacity to mentally project yourself into the past or the future, to remember specific past events with their temporal context intact, or to anticipate specific future events with genuine, detailed forward projection rather than simple, instinctual preparation. That third category is where the genuinely interesting divide opens up and where the ancient human story becomes most directly relevant. Let's talk about biological time first, because it's worth establishing clearly that this level of time experience is genuinely universal and genuinely ancient. Circadian rhythms, the approximately 24-hour internal biological clocks governing sleep and waking, hormone cycles, body temperature, and numerous other physiological processes appear across essentially every studied animal species, from insects to elephants, from fish to ancient humans, representing one of the most evolutionarily ancient and most deeply conserved features of living biology. This level of time experience doesn't require consciousness, doesn't require any sophisticated cognitive representation of time as a concept, and doesn't distinguish meaningfully between cognitively simple and cognitively complex species. A bacterium has circadian rhythms. A crow has circadian rhythms. An ancient human has circadian rhythms. In this most fundamental sense, essentially, everything alive experiences biological time, and the question of whether animals feel time. The same way we do starts from a baseline of shared biological temporal experience that runs remarkably deep across the entire tree of life. Seasonal timing works similarly, representing deeply ancient, broadly distributed biological time experience that far predates anything resembling sophisticated animal cognition. The migration of birds across enormous distances, triggered by changing day length and calibrated with extraordinary precision to arrival timing at breeding grounds, represents sophisticated temporal experience in a behavioral sense without necessarily involving any conscious cognitive representation of time as an abstract concept. Various mammals entering hibernation before winter begins, timing their feeding behavior to maximize fat accumulation at exactly the right seasonal moment, demonstrate reliable, sophisticated seasonal temporal calibration through mechanisms that appear to involve internal biological tracking rather than any cognitive anticipation of the future in the sense that human future anticipation involves. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting and where the question starts to have real, significant answers beyond everything experiences biological time rhythms. Let's talk about interval timing, the ability to accurately judge and respond to durations of time ranging from seconds to hours, because this is where meaningful differences between species start to emerge. Research on interval timing across diverse animal species has produced genuinely fascinating results, with many species demonstrating impressive, accurate interval timing in specific, ecologically relevant contexts. Pigeons, rats, chimpanzees, and various other species can be trained to respond correctly at specific time intervals in laboratory settings with accuracy that genuinely impresses researchers, and various field studies have documented animals timing behaviors with impressive accuracy in naturalistic contexts, hunting prey at the specific time of day or tidal cycle when their target is most available, returning to food sources at intervals calibrated to their replenishment cycle, performing territorial displays at specific times within a daily cycle. What's less clear and considerably more debated is whether this impressive interval timing capability involves anything resembling the subjective, experienced duration that humans associate with waiting, with boredom when a period feels long, with the strange way time seems to speed up when you're engaged and slow down when you're anxious. Research on the subjective experience of duration in non-human animals is genuinely difficult to design and interpret, precisely because subjective experience by definition can't be directly observed, only inferred from behavioral proxies that may or may not accurately reflect the underlying experience, if any such experience exists. What we can say is that certain behavioral correlates of subjective duration experience, specifically the kind of behavioral indicators associated with what might loosely be called impatience or time pressure response, do appear across various animal species in timing-relevant contexts, suggesting that something functionally analogous to subjective duration experience may be more widely distributed than purely behaviorally neutral interval timing would predict. Let's address mental time travel specifically now, because this is the concept that connects most directly to the ancient human story and represents the most significant and most interesting cognitive divide between human and animal temporal experience that research has so far identified. Mental time travel, as researchers define it, involves the capacity to consciously remember specific past events with their temporal and contextual details intact, what researchers sometimes call episodic memory, as distinguished from semantic memory, knowing facts without remembering the specific episode in which they were learned, and to project oneself into imagined future scenarios with genuine, detailed, flexible forward planning. The combination of these two capabilities, traveling mentally backward and forward in time, is what underlies the kind of temporal consciousness that seems distinctively human, the ability to feel the weight of your past as continuous with your present identity, and to experience the future as something genuinely real and meaningful that your current actions affect. Now, here's where the animal research becomes genuinely, surprisingly interesting, because the clean line between humans and all other animals on mental time travel has become considerably less clean as research has progressed. Research on western scrub jays, subsequently renamed California scrub jays, has produced some of the most compelling and most discussed evidence for something resembling episodic-like memory in a non-human animal. These birds, who cache food in various locations, show behavioral evidence that they remember not just where they cached food, but what specific food was cached and when, allowing them to prioritize retrieving perishable food cached more recently over non-perishable food cached longer ago, apparently because they remember the specific caching episode with temporal context detailed enough to inform these differential retrieval decisions. Researchers studying this behavior have specifically argued that it represents something functionally equivalent to episodic memory, remembering what happened, where, and when in a specific past episode, rather than simply knowing facts about food location without any temporal contextual detail. Great apes have shown behavioral evidence in various research contexts of something resembling future planning that goes beyond simple instinctual preparation, the kind of planning that involves representing a specific future scenario that doesn't yet exist and adjusting current behavior based on that mental representation. Research on chimpanzees and orangutans has documented cases of these animals carrying tools to locations where they would later be needed, apparently because they had some mental representation of a future need at a specific future time and place, rather than simply responding to an immediately present cue. Whether this constitutes genuine future mental time travel in the full sense that human future thinking involves remains actively debated, but the behavioral evidence is substantive enough that most researchers now consider at least some degree of future-oriented mental representation as a capability not entirely limited to humans, even if humans appear to possess it in a considerably more elaborate, flexible, and temporally extended form. Let's talk about something genuinely important here regarding what the ancient human evening fire-gathering culture we've discussed throughout this entire series tells us about human temporal experience specifically, because this is where the abstract cognitive science connects directly and meaningfully to the concrete ancient human story. We've established across multiple videos in this series that ancient human evening gatherings around fire were the primary venue for storytelling, and storytelling is one of the most direct, most revealing expressions of human mental time travel capability available. A story is, at its cognitive core, a structured mental journey through time, carrying both the storyteller and the listeners backward through remembered past events, then sometimes forward through anticipated future scenarios, using nothing but language and imagination to actually visit specific times that aren't present in current sensory reality. The ancient human who sat around a fire and told the group about the wolf encounter from 3 months ago, complete with specific contextual details about where exactly it happened, what the weather was doing, what she was feeling when the wolf stood blocking her path, was performing an act of mental time travel that most animal cognitive researchers would currently classify as uniquely or near uniquely human. She wasn't just reporting information about wolf behavior, she was taking her listeners and herself on a mental visit to a specific past moment, complete with its temporal and emotional texture, in a way that made that past moment feel genuinely present in the firelit evening of 3 months later. That's mental time travel, and doing it well enough that other people can actually share the temporal journey through language and shared imagination is one of the most remarkable things human minds do, and one of the capabilities most clearly related to the distinctive quality of human temporal experience. Now let's bring in fermented honey and the loosened evening atmosphere we've referenced throughout this series, because there's actually a genuinely fascinating connection between altered states of consciousness and temporal experience that's worth addressing directly here. One of the most consistently documented effects of mild intoxication on subjective time experience is the alteration of subjective duration, the way time feels like it moves at a different pace when consciousness is mildly altered by fermented substances compared to ordinary sober consciousness. This isn't a trivial or purely trivial observation. The fact that subjective time experience is demonstrably alterable through changes in brain chemistry tells us something genuinely important about the nature of temporal experience itself. It isn't simply a direct readout of objective time passing, but a constructed, actively generated subjective experience that depends on specific brain processes that can be speeded up, slowed down, and otherwise altered in ways that genuinely change what time feels like, rather than simply changing how accurately it's measured. Ancient humans experiencing this altered temporal experience around their evening fires, laughing perhaps at how the night had seemed to both rush and stretch simultaneously, were in their own experiential way encountering something genuinely philosophically interesting about the nature of time experience. That what time feels like is not the same thing as what time is. That subjective duration is a construction of consciousness rather than a simple readout of physical time. They couldn't have articulated this in these terms, obviously, but the experience itself was real, and the fact that it was consistently available as part of the regular ancient evening gathering culture likely contributed in various ways to the particular richness and diversity of ancient human temporal experience, adding yet another layer to the already distinctively complex human relationship with time that the storytelling culture, the burial practices, the planning ahead for seasonal changes, and every other behavior we've documented throughout this series all express in their different ways. Let's address something genuinely fascinating about the relationship between language and temporal experience, because this connection is probably the most important and most direct explanation for why human temporal experience appears to differ so significantly from even the most cognitively sophisticated non-human animals. Language provides something that non-linguistic animal cognition appears to lack: a systematized, shareable symbolic framework for representing time explicitly, past, present, and future as distinct, nameable, navigable conceptual categories. The tense system of human language isn't just a grammatical convenience. It's a cognitive tool that actively organizes and shapes temporal experience by providing a reliable framework for representing where in time any given event sits relative to any other event or to the current moment. Ancient humans developing and using tense-based language, even in the earliest, simplest forms, were developing a cognitive tool that allowed them to organize their mental life across time in ways that non-linguistic animals, however cognitively sophisticated in other respects, simply cannot access in the same way. The ability to say, even in the most primitive linguistic form, that happened before, this is happening now, that will happen after, and to share those representations with other minds through language provides a scaffolding for temporal experience that makes distinctively human forms of planning, reminiscing, and temporal narrative construction possible in ways they cannot be without it. This connects directly back to ancient human evening culture in a genuinely important way. Those evening storytelling sessions weren't just transmitting information. They were exercising and deepening exactly the language-based temporal cognitive capabilities that make human temporal experience distinctive. Each story requiring the storyteller and listeners to mentally inhabit specific past or future moments through language, building and refining the shared symbolic framework that makes complex, extended mental time travel possible for a whole group of minds simultaneously, rather than being confined to individual private experience. Now let's talk about something genuinely interesting regarding how death awareness specifically relates to temporal experience, because this connection is philosophically important and connects directly to burial practices and grief behaviors we've documented across multiple earlier videos in this series. The awareness of personal mortality, the ability to mentally project yourself into a future where you no longer exist, requires exactly the kind of mental time travel capability we've been discussing: extended forward projection combined with the ability to imaginatively inhabit scenarios where circumstances are radically different from current reality. Researchers studying death awareness across species have specifically linked meaningful death awareness to mental time travel capability, proposing that only species with genuine future mental time travel capability can truly grasp their own mortality, rather than simply responding to immediate death-associated stimuli. Ancient humans who buried their dead carefully, who placed objects with the deceased, who apparently mourned across extended periods as the skeletal evidence and documented care for the dead suggests they did, were demonstrating not just emotional depth and social attachment, but a specific temporal cognitive capability: the ability to represent a future in which a currently present person would no longer be present, and to find that mentally represented future genuinely, emotionally significant. This is mental time travel in the service of grief and loss, and it represents one of the most distinctively human uses of temporal cognitive capability, using the future projection capacity that ancient human minds had developed primarily for practical planning, and applied it toward grappling with existential reality in ways that no non-human animal appears to engage into the same emotional and behavioral depth. Let's also address something genuinely fascinating about the relationship between boredom and a temporal experience, because boredom turns out to be a remarkably interesting indicator of temporal consciousness when you examine it carefully. Boredom, at its cognitive core, is the unpleasant experience of time passing too slowly relative to the engagement level of current activity. A subjective sense that the present moment is extending beyond what feels appropriate or comfortable. Researchers studying boredom have specifically proposed that it requires exactly the kind of mental time travel we've been discussing, specifically the ability to be simultaneously aware of the present moment and to be mentally projecting toward a future moment when conditions will presumably be different, making the present feel inadequate by comparison to the imagined future. This means boredom, as an emotional experience, may actually be a reasonable proxy indicator for the kind of mental time travel capability we've been discussing, with species demonstrating clear behavioral indicators of something resembling boredom in low stimulation conditions, potentially revealing something about their temporal consciousness in the process. Various cognitively sophisticated animal species in captivity show behavioral patterns that researchers studying animal welfare specifically interpret as indicators of something resembling boredom, repetitive, apparently purposeless behavior that increases in low stimulation environments and decreases when novel stimulation is introduced, patterns that parallel human boredom responses closely enough that animal welfare researchers take them seriously as welfare indicators. Whether these behavioral patterns reflect anything resembling the subjective duration experience of human boredom remains impossible to confirm directly, but the parallel is substantive enough that some researchers now consider the capacity for something resembling boredom as potentially correlated with the general level of mental complexity and future orientation that makes sophisticated temporal experience possible. Let's bring this all together toward a genuinely direct, specific answer to the question this video has been building toward, because the evidence we've covered deserves synthesis rather than simply being left as a collection of interesting observations without a clear takeaway. Do animals feel time the same way ancient and modern humans do? Based on the universally shared biological and circadian time experience that runs across essentially all living things, the impressive but apparently non-experiential interval timing capabilities documented across many species. The tantalizing but genuinely limited evidence for something resembling episodic memory and future planning in corvids and great apes, the powerful and apparently unique connection between human language and the richness and flexibility of human temporal mental representation, the specific evidence of extended mental time travel in ancient human storytelling, grief behavior, burial practices, and long-term planning behavior, and the philosophical connection between mortality awareness and temporal consciousness that distinguishes ancient human engagement with death from most animal responses to it. The honest answer is layered and genuinely interesting. No, animals do not appear to feel time the same way ancient or modern humans do, at least not in the full, rich, linguistically organized, past and future traversing, morality-aware, narrative-structured way that distinctively human temporal experience involves. But the divide is considerably more gradual and more biologically continuous than a clean human versus all other animals line would suggest, with various cognitively sophisticated species demonstrating genuine, meaningful, if more limited capabilities that represent points on the same cognitive continuum that eventually, in humans, produced the full richness of human temporal experience. And maybe that's the most genuinely interesting, most genuinely humbling takeaway hidden in all of this. The woman sitting by her morning fire in ancient Africa, waiting for something to happen later, thinking about something from last week, planning for something next season, was doing something that genuinely distinguished her mind from the monitor lizard 20 feet away in a way that matters, deeply and specifically. But the distance between her temporal mind and the monitor lizards isn't absolute. It's a long continuum built across hundreds of millions of years of evolution, through all the intermediate forms of temporal experience that live in the minds of every social, cognitively complex species sitting between them on the evolutionary tree. She sat by her morning fire, waiting. The monitor lizard sat in the sun, not waiting for anything at all. That difference is real, and it's important. But it didn't come from nowhere, and it doesn't stand completely alone in the animal world. It's the leading edge of something that's been quietly developing across the entire history of animal cognition, reaching its most elaborate, most linguistically rich, most temporally extended expression in the species that eventually gathered around evening fires to tell each other stories about things that happened before and things that might happen after, weaving past and future into a shared temporal fabric that no other species has yet managed to match.